morning, everyone. All right, that sounds a little bit like it. And even if you are not awake right now, I can assure you that with our plenary session that will kick off the day and all the amazing sessions that we have lined up for you today, you will be awake in just a few minutes. We are delighted to have the second day of the AFS Global Conference kicking off with such a wonderful attendance again. And today we really have a packed full agenda for you. The day will start with a plenary here, and then we will have several concurrent sessions, some special AFS Now sessions for you all. And we hope that you will keep the energy up. We will build on the important discussions that we got started here last night. And hopefully by the end of the day, you will be going back to your rooms with a lot of new ideas, a lot of new connections, and a lot of new action items that you will follow up on. And to get us started for the day, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Andreas Schleicher as our keynote speaker this morning. Andreas is the Director of Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris. Andreas is the chief architect behind the PISA international testing and the framework for global competence that was recently introduced. Andreas is a highly respected leader in education, using the global stage to passionately advocate for investing in education and preparing students to thrive in a global world. He's a true leader for us, for the global education movement, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome him to the stage. Please join me.
Good morning, and thank you, Hazar. And I want to also thank you for the work that you are doing at AFS. I mean, the experience and expertise that you bring to the world to build bridges, to build this kind of bridging social capital that we so badly need is really very much needed in this time in which we live today. We are all born with bonding social capital. We love our families, we like people who are similar to us, who think like we do, and so on. But bridging social capital and working with people who think differently from us, who feel differently from us, who come from different cultures. It's really about hard work. It's about experience. It's about exchange. And there's no organization in the world that does bring more expertise to the table and more experience than AFS, with 1 million people in the field who can activate that. Let me sort of talk a bit about what is driving the importance of this today. If you think about 10 years ago, we all got these little devices in our hands, smartphones. And they really empower us to do amazing things. Technology used to be in a kind of device in a computer, but then a little bit later, technology got out in the field. The virtual reality and the real reality began to integrate, to merge, and suddenly we were all connected. Now, that's the kind of wonderful side of technology that we all experience. But the other side of this is that it's much harder these days to find out, what's true, what's not true. In the 20th century, something simple like literacy was about extracting knowledge from a book that somebody else had written. And if you read the book, you could trust to be true what you read. Today, you look something up on Google or Weibo or Yandex, you find 100,000 answers to your question, and nobody tells you what's right or what's wrong, what's true, what's not true. Even something simple like literacy has fundamentally changed in the times in which we live. Literacy has become about constructing knowledge, navigating ambiguity, finding your way through conflicting kind of pieces of information. And I just said, how wonderful technology has connected all of us, but it actually has connected us with people who think like us. And social media create this kind of echo chambers in which we live together with people who are just like us. And it's actually much harder for people today to see diversity in the world, to encounter people who think differently, who work differently. The things that we took for granted in the past are much, much harder and require real world. That's where global competency really comes in this field. Just to give you an impression out of this, we asked young people in the PISA assessment how they relate to technology. And you can see in virtually the majority of countries, it says at least half of the boys and girls at age 15 who say, well, I feel really bad if I'm not connected. No. Being connected has become like, drinking water, breathing air. It's part of our daily life. And if you just think how rapidly the time has increased that people spend online. When you look the figures for 2012 in yellow and for 2015 in blue, in some countries the time students spend online outside of school day has virtually doubled in 3 years. The virtual world is becoming the real world for many of us these days, and we have to come to grips with this. Global competence is our capacity to engage with diversity. It's really the kind of antidote to those kinds of developments. And if you think about digitalization in greater detail, on the one hand you can say digitalization has been incredibly democratizing. Everybody can participate, everybody can collaborate, everybody can contribute. Enormously powerful social networks and so on. But at the very same time, digitalization is also concentrating power at a rate that we've never seen before. On the one hand, digitalization has been incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard throughout the world. Post something on Twitter and everybody can know about it. But at the very same time, digitalization has also been incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness. Everything becomes sort of the same. Digitalization has been incredibly empowering. You can go here through the streets of Budapest and you can be an entrepreneur these days without having a lot of money. In fact, if you look at the companies that are most successful these days, they all had the product before they had the money. They had the idea. It's the big idea that creates success these days. And it's the powering sort of technology. In the past, you wanted to do something great, you needed lots of money, lots of people, lots of resources, lots of time, lots of experience. Today, all you need is a big idea. You can change the world for better or for worse. But at the very same time, technology can also be incredibly disempowering. When we become sometimes the slaves of some computer algorithm that tells us what to do, what not to do, whether to go left or right, when you switch on the navigation in your car. And even something that is close to your heart, global competency. Think about language competency. Some would tell you, why would you learn a foreign language these days? Google Translate is becoming so good, it's now becoming real, connecting people. Language learning is no longer really something that we need to talk to convey messages to something. But the idea of language learning, to be open to somebody else's culture, to have a window to the world, to reflect on your own understanding, on your own language. It's the moment that you learn a foreign language that you actually understand what language means, that you understand your own language. Those things risk to get lost in the world in which we live. That has become very convenient. And technology, in a way, is only one of those forces. There are lots of other things that we could be talking about that make global competency today sort of the core of 21st century education. When you think about it, the world of knowledge is expanding exponentially. Every day there's something coming new to this, and it's filled with so many ideas, so many facets, so many concepts. And what is important, we don't learn in the abstract. Knowledge always comes with people. Learning is a very social experience. That's why MOOCs and technology platforms in themselves are actually very ineffective in the learning world. Learning is always a relational, social experience. Things come together with people. And then you think about, the small world of the school curriculum and what we do in school. We want to bring everything into this world. That's sort of our ambition. Well, what we often see is as soon as we do that, the rich facets of the world end up as very shallow shadows of their own in the school curriculum. Somehow we succeed to make the most beautiful things sort of boring in a kind of school lesson. You don't have to talk about global competency. You can take something simple like, science. If you ask students in primary grade, they all love science. Science is about experimenting, understanding how the world works, doing things, trying things out, seeing things, experimenting, and so on. When you ask students in secondary schooling, they all hate this kind of subject because it's become a dry world of formulas and equations. We've sort of succeeded to make this a misery, and that happens in many other fields. No? History. History is an amazing subject. It can tell you how the narrative of a society has evolved, developed, sometimes unraveled over time, how different societies have developed different narratives, and that's sort of the beauty of history. Think like an historian, it's a great thing. But again, we make this sort of a world of facts and names and places, and that loses those kinds of ideas. And our response often is to get more and more things into this little box. But actually, what we see is a very crowded place that has sort of a lack of depth of understanding. And when we think about, what education really is about, think about the realm of human knowledge, think about the realm of ethics and judgment, think about the realm of political and civic life, understanding society, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, design. If artificial intelligence technology do one thing these days, it's about pushing us much harder to think about what it means to be human in these days. How can we pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the human qualities that enable us to draw value from all of this world? We have at the OECD, we have thought about this quite a bit. What are those features of a 21st century education? Knowledge always comes up high on this. But actually, we have a lot of knowledge that we can now access through other means. And actually, the kind of epistemic understanding is becoming so much more important. It's no longer sort of about knowing a lot of mathematical equations and so on. It's about being able to think like a mathematician, being able to think like a philosopher, being able to think like an historian, being able to think like a scientist rather than to accumulate lots of knowledge in biology and chemistry. And that, of course, is much harder to achieve in the education system. But actually, knowledge is just one part of it. So the skill component, being able to do something, has a cognitive dimension, has also a social and emotional dimension. How can we live and work together? Those are very, very important features. And I want to bring something in that I know often is, controversial. It's a question of attitudes and values. You can know a lot of things. You can be able to do a lot of things, but without sort of having that kind of compass that helps you navigate uncertainty, ambiguity, and so on, those kinds of knowledge and skills will not create value for yourself and for society. So it's a very important dimension. And when I talk about competency, what I really mean is your capacity to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources in a context to do something. And again, I think there's no organization that knows that better than AFS. It's about doing something, changing society. It's about change making that really makes a difference. And when you think about, agency is always at the heart of this. What my willingness to take responsibility in the world, responsibility for myself, responsibility for others, responsibility for our community. And there's sort of three classes that we think are really at the heart of this. The first is to do with our capacity to create value, to do something that has intrinsic positive worth. And again, that's probably the biggest differentiator between humans and computers these days. And the computers think what we have thought. Our ideas, sort of to develop new ideas, to actually change the world, is very, very important. But also our capacity, and again, you can see the link to global competency, our capacity to manage tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white and right and wrong. It's about navigating ambiguity that makes sort of people successful these days. And that's really, really hard. Hard to teach, hard to develop. It's very easy to teach students the right answer to a question. It's much harder to teach students to question the established wisdom of our times. Very, very important. And then again, how do you put it all together? How do you take responsibility? How do you have the kind of intellectual and moral maturity to make decisions, to put things into action? When you ask yourself, what does this mean for modern education? What does it mean for schools? Some implications are very important. The first is our capacity to anticipate. And what I mean with this is simply to be open. Once again, we're very good in school to convey our knowledge to the next generation, but to create that sense of openness, openness to other ideas, openness to other cultures, openness to the next big ideas that we can't yet clearly see, openness to connect the dots where the next innovation is going to come from, the next big idea. That openness, and that's really also something very much at the heart of global competency. But again, you know, openness is important, but of the same importance is our capacity to step back, to see the bigger picture, to find meaning in things, to see the forest among the trees, and again, putting anticipation and reflection into action, doing something with. That's the ultimate test of truth. So things important. Now, you know, you ask yourself, where does global competency actually fit into this? But more or less, this whole framework of competence in the 21st century is really about global understanding, global competency. That has been sort of, in the past, it used to be something, you know, relevant for a few people, you know, people who travel internationally, who look outwards. Today, diversity has arrived at everybody's doorsteps. Globalization isn't about people traveling. Globalization is something that has arrived for everybody. You know, you turn on the television, you go in a supermarket, you go on the street, and everywhere success is about diversity. In fact, we are in the heart of Europe here, and there's no better place in the world to see how this has actually worked in Europe. Ask yourself, when in history Europe was most successful? And it was exactly when different cultures met, you know. Europe is the kind of place where different traditions, different ideas, different cultures met. And everyone, think about the Great Renaissance now. Every time that happened, that's when new ideas were created. The old ideas are developed by computers, and you can't compete with them. Now, computers will be better to remember what we know. Computers will be able to better think more efficiently the thoughts we have thought, and so on. But to develop that kind of novelty requires to develop those kinds of bridges. That is at the heart of global competency. Now, people talk about it. It's actually quite hard to define about what we actually mean by this. And it took us many, many years at the OECD to actually develop an understanding among the 80 countries that take part in the PISA assessment. And I have with me here my colleague Mario Piacentini, who's been sort of the mastermind of that process. And it has been a very, very ambitious and difficult process to develop a shared understanding, also something that we can ultimately measure. Now you ask yourself, you know, why the hell would you want to build metrics, measures around global competency? And the answer to this is simply, we need a shared understanding, and we need to make those things visible. At the end of the day, we're going to change what we can see, what we can feel, and we believe that's really important. But again, come to what lies behind this. I want to highlight, you could talk about this, you know, for days. I know you're going to do this over the next days. But actually, I just want to highlight 4 aspects of this. One thing that is really important is our capacity to combine knowledge and also critical reasoning, to develop depths of understanding of different, you know, cultural dimensions, different ways of thinking. Knowledge is great, you know, you can know a lot of things, but actually it's the understanding, the depth of understanding that creates meaning. And again, that's what distinguishes us from computers. No? Google knows everything, but understands nothing. That's what humans do. No? Humans create meaning for things. No? That's what global competency is about. Do I really sort of create meaning in the societies that I see, in this otherness that is around me? And you can do that in almost any subject. Now, this is not a kind of a new school subject. Almost anything that we teach in school lends itself to look at this from different lenses and angles. And the more perspectives, the more lenses we develop, the richer our understanding really becomes. No? But this is not everything. There's another dimension I want to highlight here, and that's basically our willingness and capacity to actually be open to the novelty. You take that for granted, you think, well, curiosity is something that we are born with. Maybe, but curiosity is something that we need to nourish, that we need to develop, that we need to give opportunities for. If we want young people to be open to the world, we have to give them experiences. You know, they have to take risks. If they take risks, they may make mistakes. If we are not very good in tolerating mistakes and help people to learn from mistakes, we're not going to see people to become curious. We're not going to see people to develop that kind of capacity. We also need to recognize that when we see behavior, the behavior of others and our own, it's all shaped by the lenses through which we see the world. Objective truth is a nice word, but in the end we look at the truth, we look at the reality always through different perspectives. And again, the more we understand different perspectives, the richer our picture of the truth will become. So globally competent students are those who can actually understand themselves, understand and retain their identity while seeing others. This is also always, people say global competence, it takes something away from identity or from our belief in sort of the nation and things like this. And the opposite is actually true. You understand your identity by being globally competent. Now, it's like learning language. Again, you understood your own language when you actually engaged with a foreign language. That's why children who grow up in a multilingual, multicultural environment are so much better. They have this kind of inherent capacity that is very, very hard for us to learn as adults. Now, that's, when you think about your field work, your exchanges, it starts quite late in the lives of students, actually. Many of those kinds of attitudes and values are shaped very, very early on. We know today through research that, for example, things like empathy, like openness, like curiosity, we're talking about, very small children where actually many of those dispositions are developed. Things that we often treat as, sometimes we say, character qualities or personality traits. No? Because we thought those things were things that we are born with, that are sort of belong to us. But in fact, we now know those are actually skills that we can develop with the right environment. So willingness and capability to understand global issues and also to accept multiple kind of attitudes through kind of skills is really important. I want to bring a third aspect into this is that we also find very important, and that is basically to being capable to engage with others in a way that is open, again, accepting. And I mean more than tolerance here. Now, tolerance means, I'm going to be patient with somebody else. No, I mean really being open, being curious about that otherness, seeing this as an opportunity to enrich myself, to learn myself. Being able to also, capable to adapt my style of communication. That's so interesting. When you talk about mathematics, you can say, well, the more the better, as a linear construct. When you think about intercultural communication understanding, actually it's a combination of qualities. It depends on the context. What makes you a great communicator in the United States may make you run against the wall in Japan and vice versa. And being able to understand those things is what makes you globally competent. The capacity to interact with others in ways that are open, again, sensitivity, engagement, and that are appropriate. And of course, you want to be effective. You want to be understood and make yourself understood and understand others. And again, while you can say those three elements are important, they are not everything. I want to bring a fourth one into this, and that's probably the most difficult one, the hardest one that we need to think about, and that's basically being able to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional attributes. That's why, you could never replace AFS by, technology or digital kind of experiences or online experiences. This is about, going somewhere, living with a family, experiencing the other kind of world. That's something that is very, very hard to do, and that's really, I think, something that we often miss in the world. In a way, in our schools, we have made young people passive consumers. You can turn on the television, see a lot of things around the world, but you're not going to be taking this kind of activity and action that is so important. When we think about global competency, that's really what we got to talk about. Now, how do we actually observe? How do we actually measure this? I want to just highlight this very briefly because, again, I know there's a lot of skepticism around it. A lot of people question, should this be done? Can this be done? Let me talk about the outer ring of this. Now, I start with something that may be most familiar to you, and that's the knowledge element. Now, think about, what we know about cultures, ideas. And these are things that we can actually quite easily test. To what extent are young people familiar with the world, familiar with the interdependence in the world? No. When you drink a cup of coffee here, right, in Budapest, well, that has somehow implications for people in South America who produce their coffee, the ways of work, and things like this, that interconnectedness is something that we can teach, that we can learn, that is really, really important. Environmental sustainability, my behavior affects the behavior of others and it affects the living conditions. Some are in completely different places. Those are things that can be taught, that can be understood, and also obviously the kind of institutions that underpin kind of the multilateral work in which we live. And actually, I must tell you, you asked me to talk about the state of global competences. There are lots of interesting efforts underway. The Asia Society has compiled a lot of that material, and you can see in many countries, we have ways to incorporate, global ideas into the school curriculum of almost any subject. You can do that as well in mathematics as in music or in sports. And teacher preparation, building the understanding. And again, the knowledge transmission part is easy, but teachers who haven't experienced sort of this interconnectedness have a hard time teaching this. So perhaps the capacity is the harder part where we really need to work. And again, organizations like AFS can do miracles here because they have those people on the ground. But this is something I think we need to work harder on. But we find plenty of good examples where those things are already happening. But again, knowledge is the easy part. That's where schools have a lot of experience in. The skills part is one that is already getting harder, where we have to think harder. It's about the cognitive and the social emotional skills, being able to reason with information, see things from different perspectives, be open, be capable to communicate in an international context. On the PISA test, we're confronting young people with different scenarios where they have to sort of expose themselves to different ways of thinking, different cultural contexts. Perspective taking. That's sort of a very important aspect of empathy. When we talk about empathy, we often think about relating to somebody very specific, but empathy has the same meaning at the aggregate level. So to what extent can we take ownership of somebody else's thinking, the cognitive dimension, the social emotional dimension, understand the feelings of others, understand the behavior of others. And that doesn't mean I adopt it for myself. That's a totally different question. Where my own stances. It's really about simply being capable to see those kinds of perspectives. Our capacity to manage and resolve conflicting interests. Very important these days. Something that needs hard work, that needs to be learned. It's not something that we bring naturally with. And then adaptability. Things change. Now, our willingness to be open to change, to engage with change, those things are critically important. But again, the skills, and the skills dimension has also many expressions in today's schools. When you think about project-based learning, that's where those things are happening. Working with other students, working across different groups of teachers. Teachers can collaborate across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines, and we're seeing more and more of this. Finland has just made the transition to an almost entirely project-based, community-based curriculum. Putting agency, student agency, really at the heart, at the center. That's, again, what global competence is about. You can lead and manage discussion in a classroom. You can have structured debates, service learning. Again, something that's very close to your heart. It's an amazing way to build those kinds of experience and skills that underlie global competency. So it's not an excuse to create another school subject. In fact, I think it would be the worst way to develop global competency, because it would mean it's somebody else's responsibility, the specialist. No, it needs to be part of everything that we do, and it can be. There are really good examples of what can happen there. But again, let's make it a bit harder. Let's move on to the next part, and that's about attitudes. Openness towards people from other backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. And what I mean by culture is about the material aspects of culture, the institutional ones, the social aspects of culture, the norms and values. To what extent can I engage positively with those things? To what extent can I develop respect for cultural differences? And that, again, is more than tolerance, and see myself connected to a world in which people have different ideas, different ways of thinking, different values. No? And you can look at the rationale for this in a social perspective. No? Creating that glue in our societies is the biggest task of our times. And you can see this every day. No? But it's also, you can take an economic perspective for this. No? Development and innovation comes from our capacity to build those kinds of bridges, to connect the dots where the next big idea is going to come from. So global mindedness is today sort of the foundation for success in the 21st century. And then, of course, the hardest part, again, I come to the question of values. Some people say, well, just make values part of attitudes. No? That deals with this. We don't think so. We think actually values should become a more explicit reference in our curricula, because if you do not have a core set of values, well, you can almost justify any type of behavior because you're going to see it expressed somewhere. No? But the value of human dignity, the value of tolerance, they are ones that, again, need to be learned and need to be explicitly articulated. And you can see some countries actually moving in that direction. Singapore is the first country that introduced a values-based curriculum, where tolerance, openness, resilience actually became explicit expression. They're also the first country they made what AFS does part of their daily life. They offer every middle school student an international foreign experience because they understand those are the ways in which you can build those kinds of values. But what makes it so interesting is that when you think about, something, when you are a sports teacher there, it's not about, asking yourself, do I develop my students to become more athletics? Well, that's one thing. But it's also about, they have to explicitly think, what do I contribute to help students, young people, to take responsibility for themselves, to take responsibility for others, to engage with others. Those aspects have become very, very important ingredient. People need to reflect on this. This is the importance of embedding values explicitly in the way we teach, we learn. And some dimensions, such as human dignity, cultural diversity, are things that you would expect every student to do well. So that's basically something that is really hard to do. I don't think we have good answers. I cannot give you good answers to this, but we decided to also embed it in our PISA concept of global competency in order to make this visible. We're not going to have results until another year's time, but I do believe those results will actually help us put this on the map, because one of the greatest risks we have today is that everybody says, yeah, it's something important, but at the margin. It always comes second. And by putting this on the global kind of metrics, we hope to make it seen first on this. And actually, we're not alone on this. I just wanted to, come back. The social dimension is obvious. This is the challenge of our times. But you can see actually employers increasingly valuing this. 90% of employers in 9 countries that were surveyed sort of reported that they value intercultural skills. And what's really interesting, they thought the kind of demonstrating respect for others and also working effectively in diverse teams was more important to them than basically expertise in a specific field or a specific qualification. So again, you can see actually in the world of work, being capable and interested to work with people who are different from you has become something that is recognized as absolutely essential. We also, and this is very positive, we see many young people who see the necessity to do this, to engage with the world, to make a contribution to the world. When we had these survey results, we were very impressed how many young people want to make a contribution. When you ask them, why don't you do this? Their answer is lack of knowledge. They want to engage, but they don't have the tools, the understanding, the capacities to engage with the world. This is, again, where the work that you do at AFS is so important. This is about giving people the tools, the very practical ways to engage with others, to experience different ideas, different ways of thinking, different cultures. We need to take this to heart and take it as a very positive sign that most young people actually will be on your side if given the opportunities. Unfortunately, our school system, again, make them often passive recipients of knowledge, not active contributors to this. So that brings me to the very last point I want to make, actually. Many people say, well, this is more about social experiences, out-of-school experiences. And I don't think so. I really believe that schools are not the only institution, but they are very, very important institutions in this field. First of all, if you think about it, in the world in which we live today, school is, for many young people, the first place where they experience the diversity of our societies. They grow up in the families, even kindergarten is often quite homogeneous field, and suddenly you are in school, you're confronted with different ways of thinking, different cultures, different ideas. But schools also have a direct way to build knowledge, understanding, values, and attitudes. Social values. We did something really interesting. It's not about global competency alone, but in our last PISA assessment, we tested not only whether students were great individual problem solvers, but we actually tested to what extent they are capable to work in groups, to solve problems collaboratively. And often we think, well, if you can solve problems on your own, you're going to be able to solve problems with others. It's not like this. You can take two countries that do really well on this. The Japanese did very well on individual problem solving, and the Chinese did very well on individual problem solving. But when we tested collaborative problem solving, the Japanese did even better on this, and the Chinese did quite poorly on this. So individual problem solving doesn't guarantee collaborative problem solving. And there's a lot behind this. If you go to a classroom, a school in Japan, a lot of the learning is about social experiences. You work with other students. The stronger students help the weaker students. At the end of the school day, you clean the classroom with your teachers. You cook the meal together. And these are not sort of practical things. They are very much part of the pedagogical mission of the school. The collaborative problem solving doesn't fall from the sky, and it's the same thing with global competency. There's a lot that actually institutions like schools can do to systematically develop this. Again, it takes hard work. Building, bridging social capital is about really hard work. It doesn't come automatically naturally. Also, schools have a very, very important mission these days to give students this kind of inner compass. Success in school today is not about you learning just something. It's about you being able to develop that kind of inner compass that helps you navigate this complex, ambiguous, and volatile world. And again, that's what schools can really do well. Appreciation for other cultures. Now, that's where technology can come, and schools can now connect, and many schools do that. They become part of global communities, they connect with other schools, and we can do this. And obviously also engage in experiences, and last but not least, schools can promote the ideas and values of global competency that this is all about. Again, it is a starting point. Then it takes organizations like AFS that build the kind of real-life experiences, because once again, this is not about what happens in our brains alone. This is about what we actually do and the way in which we take responsibility. So once again, thank you for the work that you are doing.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Okay, so we knew you were a rock star of the international assessment world, but it's so great to see that you're also an incredibly powerful advocate for global competence and the values I think that we all share in this room. So thank you very much for your very powerful remarks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Danielle Obst. I'm the president and CEO of AFS. It's a pleasure to be here for day 2 and for this panel. Our theme this morning is the global competence education imperative. And I think you started, Andreas, by talking about how do we make global competence core of 21st century education. And so that's what we're going to try and explore today. Yesterday, we spoke about the why, and it was clear that global competence is essential to society, and you addressed this very well this morning also. And it's essential, global competence is essential if we want to solve both global and local challenges. It's essential if we want to turn the tide on intolerance and ignorance. It's essential if we want to thrive in ever more diverse communities. And it's also essential to counteract what you call the homogenizing or particularizing effects of digitalization. So how do we get out of our bubbles? We also know that global competence is essential for the workplace and that employers are looking for these skills. And I wanted to share an interesting statistic from a recent study that the British Council did in 9 countries among 400 employers around the world. And by far, the most highly valued skill, even higher than technical skills, was demonstrating respect for others, followed by working effectively in diverse teams, being open to new ideas and ways of thinking, and being collaborative. And this is exactly something that Peter from BP addressed yesterday as well. And so these skills, effective communication, meaningful collaboration across difference, being open-minded, able to adapt to new situations, respecting others from different backgrounds, empathy, perspective taking, these are the soft skills. Why on earth do we call them soft skills? And so what I would argue, and what I think you will agree with, is that global competence is a power skill, and global competence is mission critical for our world, and we need more people with those skills. And every day we read and hear about this urgent need to think differently about our classroom curriculums on so many different levels, and yet there's also a major disconnect between what employers need, what society needs, and perhaps what education delivers. One other study by McKinsey found that 74% of educators believe their graduates are ready for the job market. But only 42% of employers and 45% of graduates think so. So that's a challenge for us. And yesterday at the networking reception, I met a high school student, Milu Klein. Milu, are you here somewhere? Yeah, okay, you're right there, perfect. She's from the Netherlands, a high school student, and she said something that worried me a bit. She said everything she's learned about global competence was not in the classroom. And so that is a challenge for us. So how do we make sure that these skills, alongside math, science, and basic reading literacy skills, become core of the 21st century education? And so I think the panel that we're going to have now with representatives from different stakeholder groups, social entrepreneurs, NGOs that reach into the most marginalized communities, and people from backgrounds in international development will help us think that through. How do we make it core of the 21st century education? So I'd like to invite the panel up to the stage. Thank you very much. This will be, I think, a very exciting discussion. David Edwards, who was supposed to join us, couldn't join, but so we're delighted that Brian Atwood from the AFS Board of Trustees, but also from Brown University, is able to join us this morning. So please join me. So Kaya, let me start with you. We first met in Washington a few years ago. You were the chancellor of the DC public school system. And we spoke earlier today. You told me you studied abroad in Venezuela, Mexico, and Spain. So global is part of your background, but then you also made global a core part of the DC public school system, and you really turned it around. So share with us a little bit, why did you do that, how did you do that, but also how is this now influencing your role and work at Teach for All?
So thanks for having me, Danielle. I think global, as you mentioned, is sort of part of my DNA. I had a mother who was a teacher who thought that it was really important to not just expose me in the classroom, but to travel the world and to learn about different cultures. And I took that part of my education into the education that I tried to provide students with at DC Public Schools. We took seriously the imperative to create a world-class education for our young people. If it's going to be world-class, then we have to expose them to people all around the world. And I got to take advantage of Washington as an international city, where we had embassies. And so we had an embassy adoption program where all of our 5th grade classes partnered with an embassy where they got to engage in that country's culture and activities and whatnot. We thought very critically about global competence, as Andreas said, across the curriculum. And so we taught science, for example, by asking kids to design a bridge, a tarpool, which is kind of a cable bridge that's used in Nepal. And we explored issues of erosion and community planning and things, all while teaching science. Or I think about one of my favorite curriculum lessons was around teaching volume in math, where we asked our students to actually design a recyclable water bottle that would be useful in sub-Saharan Africa. They had to design it for 3 different volumes, and they had to use material that would be sustainable and that these communities could access and sort of and use regularly. And so there are ways to think about how the regular work that we do in math and science and social studies, we can incorporate a global perspective. And so that's what we did at DC Public Schools, and I think that brings, it makes the classroom experience relevant, it makes it rigorous, and kids want to engage. And I think by creating agency and making kids feel responsible to people in other places, by giving them projects, and by just asking them questions about how the world works, that's the kind of vibrant education that we want for all of our young people.
That's great. And you, we talked earlier about the unit of change. So how do we make sure this actually happens? You were able to do this at the DC public school system. How do we do this in school systems around the world? And you said, you know, first we think about the unit of change as the teacher, then we think of the school. Now your title also is community impact. So talk about the community as a unit of change and what is the role there in terms of
Sure, I mean,
competence.
I think when you're the chancellor of a public school system, right, you get to do whatever you want. And so it just so happens that global competence was my thing, and I could, by sheer force of will, impose it. That's the grasstops perspective.
We need more like you, okay?
But I think, in fact, we need grasstops. We need leaders who have an informed perspective and are pushing for this at the policy level, but at the grassroots level in communities all across the world, from the highlands of Peru to, you know, inner city London, parents and families want a world-class education. They recognize that their kids are no longer competing against people in their village or in their neighborhood, that they're competing against people from all around the world, and not just competing for jobs, but they also sort of understand the interconnectedness. And so families are asking for their kids to have these kinds of experiences. And if we're gonna be good stewards and be responsible to what families want, which frankly I think when we talk about communities as the unit of change, what we believe at Teach for All is that the solutions to education have to be locally rooted, but they have to be globally informed. And so we are building generations of leaders, teachers, and principals, and social entrepreneurs, and policymakers all across the world who lead in this way, who are asking communities, what do you want? And so when parents say they want global, then it's imperative for our leaders to bring that to them. And so by putting community at the center, we're responsive to what parents need and want. We're responsive to what students are saying they want. Students want to create a different world, and they're not afraid to do it. And I think as educators, it's incumbent upon us to create the kinds of leaders who will deliver that kind of an environment.
And you do this in 50 countries around the
48
world.
countries around the world, and
also
growing.
very underserved school districts.
We work in the predominantly marginalized school systems, and I think that that's really important. This idea that global competence is a luxury or is only for the elite, I think is a real missed opportunity. The hunger, the drive, the ambition, the dedication and commitment that we see coming from our underserved students is unparalleled, and I think we're missing out on a significant chunk of talent in the world if we're not providing these kinds of experiences to those kids.
Exactly. Andreas, let me turn to you. So you are assessing. You're going to be assessing global competence, and yet probably many of you have read that countries like the UK, the US, opt not to be assessed. What does that mean? Does that worry you? Does it mean it's going to be actually impossible to get global competence into the core of 21st century education? Or what's your perspective on this?
You know, I'm not so worried or, taken aback by this. Whenever you do something innovative, not everybody's going to follow immediately. When we started PISA, we had 5 countries, and now the whole world is part of this. And I think for Teach for All, it's a great example as well. You know, so you started in one country, and then people actually, the idea gets traction. So I think over time, as the ideas is made visible, the first thing people are going to ask next year, actually, why is our country not represented in those kinds of comparisons that everybody understands to be important? I think what we do in this first round is show that's actually a viable construct, it's something measurable, we can make those kind of global competences visible, and I think every math teacher, every science teacher is going to ask themselves, you know, actually what can we do in this field? That's really what PISA does. It makes people reflect, to think, to step back, and I think that's what we're going to achieve. You know, we have 57 out of 80 countries that do something in this field in the PISA context. So I think that's a great start, and we're going to build on that.
And you've talked earlier about what Singapore is doing, what Finland is doing. What else is actually working? What are some countries doing to actually really bring global competence into the national curriculum?
Well, when it comes to the curriculum, I'm actually quite optimistic. You know, we work on a large project on curriculum design in the OECD called Education 2030, and most countries actually reflect these ideas that we talk about now in the design of curricula. I'm much more sort of concerned about how do you actually make it happen. How does the intended curriculum becomes the implemented curriculum, and the implemented curriculum, the achieved curriculum. I must really say that education is still a very inward-looking operation. Teachers are often very isolated in the classroom. They're not connected to their colleagues. They're not connected to other schools, not to talk about global competency. And I was actually part of a very interesting enterprise. You know, one of the typical things that PISA sparks is in 2012, you know, people saw Shanghai in China had great mathematics performance, so the British Minister of Education thought, I want to see what they actually do. So she went actually to Shanghai, saw how teachers are teaching, and I said, oh, I'm really going to invite, you know, 50 teachers from here to help my teachers understand how you can teach differently. And this idea at the beginning was received with great skepticism, even by the teaching profession. They thought, you know, I know what I need to do, I just need more time or money. And actually, the moment these teachers arrived, actually everything changed. Suddenly, you know, today they have many years after, they have 30 mathematics hubs where those teachers collaborate, but it's rare. I think we're still not very good enough. And if teachers don't experience global competencies, they're not going to be great teachers of global competencies. So creating that kind of fabric where teachers are part of a kind of interconnected community, that's why I worry more than about issues around curriculum design.
Good. Brian, you are senior fellow at the Watson Institute at Brown University. You also are well-versed in diplomacy, and you were the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development for many years. Talk to us about the role that international development agencies play in this, because you, as well as your fellow agencies in Australia, UK, and other countries, put a lot of funding and support into education. But global competence, global citizenship often is not part of that. But now it's a key goal of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what can international aid agencies do there?
Well, first, Daniel, let me thank you for this global conference, because it's unique that AFS is reaching out to partners to mobilize action in this area, and this is what is really needed. Development agencies, obviously, it's like preaching to the choir to suggest that we should be advancing the cause of global competence. Development professionals are globally competent. They wouldn't be in the business if they weren't. However, the other side of that coin is that development agencies are bureaucracies, and it takes a long time to get them to move in a certain direction. I remember when I first became the head of USAID, I was very interested in governance issues and thinking about democratic institutions in developing countries, because if governments aren't accountable to the people, they're not going to be very successful and you can't sustain progress. But development agencies became very nervous about that because it was political, too political in their mind. And I think we've got to get beyond this issue of whether or not we are advancing a political cause here. As you were suggesting, Andreas, what we're advancing is the notion that we should understand other perspectives, which means other ideologies or whatever. And that's extremely important. There is a large P political, which is, of course, when people are campaigning and when they're running for office or standing for office. And there's a small p political, which is that you're advancing the kinds of issues that you were talking about earlier. And we shouldn't be fearful of that. We have certainly within AFS and the other organizations that are present here, values that we consider to be extraordinarily important if the world is going to function properly. I always try to remind people that the world right now is struggling with the increase of population. 1945-46, when the UN was created, we had 2.5 billion people. Now we have 5 billion people on the face of the, 5 billion more, 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth. We're struggling with trying to manage that. Now, back to development agencies. The focus in developing countries, the poorest countries in particular, has been on primary education. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and in terms of global competence, I mean, the brain research has indicated this is the time when the synapses are the most active. But what you need in the classroom are teachers that really are stimulating that, creating the kind of imaginations. I've often said that the best development ideas have come from the developing world because people have become educated, but they also understand, you know, the environment within which they are living. I think of people like Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank and Hernando de Soto in Peru and his work. Those are ideas, some of the ideas that even came out of the Green Revolution. People give Norman Borlaug a lot of credit. He deserves it. He won the Nobel Prize, but he worked with people in India and in Pakistan and other places in South Asia to basically create the answer to the food security issues that existed at the time. So we desperately need to be thinking that we have to work with young people who need to be stimulated. They need to be thinking in the classroom about something beyond their own village. Many of these societies are the result of colonialism, and they have a number of so-called others within their own borders. And that has been the cause of tension. Poverty, there's no question that poverty relates to violent conflict. And so therefore, it's absolutely essential that even within borders that we promote global competence. So I think that we still have a struggle. I think the development agencies ought to be spending more money on tertiary education, especially for teachers. And I'll say one last thing, which is that development agencies are good at logistics. They're not so good at the quality of what happens. They can put students in classrooms, they can build schools, they can put students in a desk, next to a desk. But the quality of education, I think, is really, and I know, for example, at the OECD, where I worked for a while as the chair of the Development Assistance Committee, the Directorate for Development Cooperation was working with you, Andreas, and trying to make sure that PISA evaluations were as relevant for developing countries as they are for the developed countries, and I think that was extremely important work. So progress is being made, but if you really read the book, Why Nations Fail, it's because the competence to understand other perspectives hasn't been as it should be.
Yeah.
And we need, obviously, to push it. And that's why this is a great...
This is a good segue to Ankit. So you're not an educator, you're not an administrator, but you're a social entrepreneur. You are a trustee of the World Youth Council, but you also started your own NGO, Feed India, that I think now has 8,500 volunteers, and you have delivered more than 14 million meals in India. You partner now with Teach for India. Talk to us about, from your perspective, how can we bring more enterprise thinking to this? Because clearly it's not all within the classroom, but it's also how do you mobilize something? We've talked yesterday about this global competence initiative that we have here really is a movement. You've created a movement. What can you tell us what we should do?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Daniel, and AFS for having me here. I must say, before I start, that this is probably the first time I've seen so many educators from around the world in a single room. So thank you for having me. It's really thrilling. Well, since you've asked me a question which relates to young people and how they can be more globally competent, and I look at things from the lens of a youth myself, I can go on for days about what needs to be done. But I think the single biggest thing that we need to be doing more is investing in the dreams and opinions of young people, and kind of empowering them with tools for collaboration. We need to nurture them with experiential learning. And I mean, we live in a time when most young people now, want to change the world. It's all about how do we empower them with resources so that they can act. And I think there's a huge contrast and a gap in the society where, especially in developing countries, where now with going digital and being connected to technology, we see a lot of young people learning from internet and through social media. However, when they want to act in the local communities, they do not get the kind of environment from the classrooms which they should need. And in a way, that's literally thinking globally, but not being able to act locally. And that's where the problem really lies. And I think that kind of puts the need back into the non-formal education sector to come and intervene and start programs, entrepreneurial programs, that not just encourage people to think, but also invest in them in terms of acting on these ideas. So, in World Youth Council, we've come across opportunities or cases where a young student went to another developing part of the world and has come back to know that, 6 months later, he found out that there was a flood in that area. And the fact that he was able to connect now with the place more, but he wanted to act, and he created a water purifier, which is now the lowest, and he's patented it. So it's the lowest water purifier in the world, through which you can just put it into water and you can have clean drinking water to drink. What's interesting is that the school that he was in let go of him because he was short of attendance. And so how can we create a culture where such students who want to do things, who want to help each other, are actually empowered so they can serve as role models to others? It's a lot about not questioning them what they think. It's about challenging them on how they can solve real-world problems today and supporting them if they come up with a feasible solution. I challenge anyone here, if you're a part of an education program yourself, challenge your classroom to solve a problem being faced by the Rohingya refugees, and you will be surprised with the kind of solutions that they can build and the kind of collaborations they would want to connect with people. I also think that this is only one side of the problem. The other side is also investing in teachers. And I personally really believe that behind every successful person, there is a successful teacher somewhere, right? And in my personal opinion, I don't think teachers are given nearly enough credit that they should be given. But not investing in teachers to be able to support these students is like expecting farmers to grow strong trees without providing them with the right resources to nurture that tree. And so we need to invest in teachers and empower them with resources so they can help the students who want to be able to implement things locally. And I really think that investing in both of these things together will actually cause a lot of disruption by 2030. And I see this entire space, especially the non-formal education sector, completely changing the way we're looking at education today.
Yeah, and I think also the part that Andreas mentioned in the wheel, a core part that often we forget about is not just the knowledge acquisition, but is the taking action part, right? And how do you actually instill that either in the classroom or out of the classroom?
Right, absolutely, yeah.
So this is an opportunity now for us to take questions or comments from the audience. What I would like to do, so there are the microphones, I think, on either side. I can't see them very well, on those sides. And if I might ask Milu to do the first comment, because I'd like very much to have the voice of a student represented. And what are your concerns or challenges or thoughts around this? What do you not see in the classroom? What do you want to see?
Looking around me, I'm probably the only student that is here today and that has been here at this conference. And I was just wondering, how do you think you should involve students in developing these new ways of of teaching and in developing these new curriculums that do involve globalism and that do teach us, the students, the global competence that we will need in the future.
Thank you. So we'll address this in a moment, but if the other questions, if you can make your way to the microphone. So thank you very much, Milu. I think this is an incredibly important question. I know that there are a number of other students here, including many of the volunteers are actually students, but let's start with you, Andreas, on this one, and then the others as well. Is the student voice missing in this conversation around global competence? Is it part of how you are looking at how you're going to be assessing this?
Actually, the first thing I should say is that in our project Education 2030, we have a group of students that actually participate, and they have produced some of the most amazing ideas. When you think about 21st century pedagogy, I remember students from Portugal, from Hong Kong. So I think the moment, do we have good ways to listen systematically to student voice? I will question that. I think we need to do better. But I must say, actually, young people, and these were middle school students, high school students, have a very good sensitivity what actually happens. And when you mentioned earlier, actually, Danielle, you made that point that, and you as well, that, today the really important things around global competency happens outside the classroom, outside the school. That makes me worry. We created schools to solve the problems of society. If school is no longer serving their purpose and losing its relevance, we've got to change school. I don't think the answer is, let's create something else in addition. It's really about changing the heart of schooling.
Mm-hmm. Other reflections? Kaya, Brian.
Sorry, Kaya, if you want. I had a chance when I was the head of USAID to give an award to a school that had developed a sort of sister city, sister school relationship with a school in Pakistan that was in Massachusetts in USA. And the reason was that they had had a visit from a young man who had been the victim of child labor, and he was going around the world basically arguing against child labor. His name was Iqbal. He went back to Pakistan. He was then assassinated by people who didn't like what he was saying. So this school began to raise money, and they actually raised enough money to build a school in Iqbal's hometown. And then, of course, with technology today, they were able to communicate. There seems to me that's a unique case, perhaps. Why can't schools have sister schools? That the technology is such that you can communicate back and forth, and that is just such a wonderful way to understand another culture, to understand what they're going through and perhaps in a developing country.
Yeah, I think this point around the engagement of students is really critical. We talk about preparing young people to change the world, right? And we think about them doing that 20 years from now. They're ready to change the world right now, and we need to give them that opportunity. We say all the time that the people closest to the problem have the best solutions. The people who know how dysfunctional school is are the kids who are sitting in classrooms every day. And we can't just listen to them, right, while we try to fix it. We actually have to engage them as co-creators of solutions, right? Some of our best ideas at DCPS came from our students. And I got to a point where before I did any budgeting, I asked 2 kids from every single high school to come and tell us what we should spend our money on and help us to develop those projects. Those ended up being the best, most transformative projects. So if we say we want kids to lead, we have to give them the opportunity to lead now.
Good, well said. So let's take 2 comments here in a row. So maybe first here and then on that side. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm coming from SoCA University of America. I'm also a student, and that was exactly the question I wrote down. Where are the students? This is just kind of a suggestion or a challenge of a way that maybe AFS could improve this conference, this already amazing conference, is by raising that number of student voices, even having a student on a panel, for instance. I think it's a really valuable, everyone here clearly values that voice, but where are they? The other question I wanted to ask Andreas, we briefly talked about it, Kaya brought it up yesterday actually. The PISA test is only testing global competence once. It's kind of like a special subject. which to me reinforces the idea that it's a special subject and that it should be treated differently and that it should only be visited, this one time. So I'm wondering, where is that incentive for it to be incorporated in more of a holistic way rather than just an additional subject that will be crammed in and then forgotten?
Great. Thank you for your comments. Let's take the other comment as well and then address them together, please.
Good morning, everybody. I am Seema Sheikh from India. On behalf of all my colleagues over here, Neeta, Kalpana, and Larzi, I would like to put across this question because we are teachers and teacher educators. And as we saw yesterday also, that India has a long way to go where global competency is concerned. And we as educators are trying to move towards it and trying to frame curriculum. And when we have our meetings and debates about it, we have two schools of thought where some of our group members and where our educators feel that global competency should be made as a separate subject in the class and should not be integrated with all the other subjects, whereas others feel that the whole ethos of global competency will be lost. We will be not achieving what we are really looking at for if we don't integrate into all the subjects, whereas some feel that initially we should not intimidate our participants, our students, as well as our teachers by integrating it in a subject, but let us keep it as a separate component, as a separate subject, for which again getting permissions and everything becomes a big issue. So what is your take, whether we should really begin with integration or we should really start with global competency as a separate subject in our school curriculum?
Thank you very much. Two very interesting and somewhat related questions, right? Is global competence a special subject that we look at once? And or should global competence be integrated into regular instruction, or is it a separate subject altogether? Andreas, why don't we start with you and then get comments from the rest of the panel?
I want to just clarify that our intention at the OECD is to make global competency a kind of ongoing stream of the PISA idea. We may need to find different instruments for this. And I want to highlight, just the analog of problem-solving skills. In 2003, we had a very, specific view on problem solving. In 2012, we took it further to individual problem solving. Then came collaborative problem solving. And in a way, the global competency builds on this, and we have to just look at over time to develop the right instruments. It's not like math or science where we have a pretty clear idea how it should be. So the development of the kind of ideas, concepts, instruments needs to go in step with this. But there is an absolute commitment. When you look at our 2030 framework, student agency and global competency are at the heart, at the very center of this. On a brief comment on the second question, I think you raise a very, very important point. It's easy to say it should be sort of part of everything, but sometimes when we make things everybody's responsibility becomes nobody's responsibility. And I do think there's a real dilemma here. On the one hand, it may be the right starting point to start out with something that people can see, where they can actually see someone is responsible for this. The risk, however, in the long run is that then, everybody says, okay, Brian, thank you very much for teaching global competencies, or I don't have to deal with this in history and math and science. So in the long run, it's really, and I don't think you can teach global competency very well as an isolated subject. Global competency is really about integrating ideas, integrating cultures, connecting, and so on. So I do think the idea of global competences really lends itself to project-based, cross-curricular learning, and that's, I think, I see as the goal. But you may well be right that the starting point needs to be something that, people can somehow see and feel tangible.
Yeah, initially.
Ankit, what about your perspective on this?
Well, first of all, I completely hear you and I completely agree with you. We need to have more young people getting a seat at the table, right? And so I think, the notion of creating programs for young people needs to change. We need to create programs with young people. The learning is so fast these days, it's very tough to reinvent a school on the basis of the learnings that we're having on an ongoing basis. And so there needs to be involvement of young people in terms of kind of defining global competence for themselves too. And I think that's a very integral part of the school. In terms of her question of if it should be a separate subject, I also agree with you, it's such an intrinsic value that can't kind of be fathomed in a particular classroom. It needs to be an ongoing discussion, an ongoing collaboration. But there needs to be more interconnectedness between more of a global classroom. How can a classroom in one part of the world be connected with the other on a similar project? And while the issue may have different contexts culturally and socially in both countries, it might still have some common threads and values. And so I think that's kind of a need which needs to be encouraged more.
Yeah, and there's some great new organizations popping up, like Empatico, for example, that connect classrooms around the world specifically on issues like this. Let's take a comment from Brian, and then we'll end with Kaya.
Just an interesting experience that I think relates to this and relates to what both of you were saying, and that is when there was an effort back in the 60s at USAID to say that maybe we should be caring more about women in development. So they created an office called Women in Development at USAID. And so everyone in the rest of the place said, well, they do women in development. And what they were doing was basically research, which was really important, and it certainly made the case over time that this was something that ought to be integrated into every program. This sounds really strange in the Me Too era to be saying this now. This is 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But I think maybe the same thing. There ought to be research done. There ought to be a special place where at development agencies and other places where you look at this issue and how then can one create curricula that can be integrated into science, history, reading, and everything else. But I think we're obviously at that point where it's now dawned on everyone, and most importantly on the PISA efforts, that this is an incentive. What you do provides an incentive for people to really care. I also think, frankly, if I could get into this large P politics of the day, that the populism and nationalism and even nativism that is occurring in our political systems around the world, not just in the United States or Europe, is something we have to react to. We really have to start at the local level or at the school level or whatever to try to deal with this, because this is very, very dangerous to the world we're living in.
Kaya, let's end with you.
Sure, I mean, I'm going hard on this integration piece. Because people don't live compartmentalized lives, right? We don't have 45 minutes in a day where we're thinking about math and then 45 minutes in a day where we're thinking about social studies. Our lives are ones, and the lives that our students are living are ones where science and social studies and globalism and everything else are integrated. And so the best classrooms that we see, the best teaching that we see are lessons when you begin to mix those different disciplines and kids can understand how they exist in the real world. And so I think that in addition to the danger of it just becoming the global competence people's business and not everybody's business, I think it actually doesn't simulate real life when we put global competence in a box by itself. And if we're really preparing kids to operate in a new world, it has to be in an integrated kind of way.
So our topic was the global competence education imperative. So I think what we've answered is it's imperative. I think we have a few challenges ahead of us, whether they relate to the bureaucracies we are battling, whether it relates to who exactly is the unit of change. But I think what we've come away with is both some practical solutions, but also, and I think that what should guide us in the next days is working with students as co-creators of solutions. And I think this is where we need to go if we really want to address this imperative issue. So I'd like to thank this panel for this very good discussion. Thank you, Andreas, for your keynote address. And please help me thank this group.
Very good, Andreas. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can exit that.